just automatically changed that. We can see now that it's actually causing a little bit of bump in the preview, which is good. I'm just going to change the resolution of the render to be a little bit bigger, and I'm going to do a crop render, and I'm also going to up the settings. You'll notice that to increase the quality, if I just drag our render setup, the way I've got the settings here is that it's mostly being done with anti-aliasing. So let me just crop this. Obviously, if your plants are much further away than this, I'd recommend just turning off bump mapping altogether, and it will most likely come down to the balance of diffuse versus reflection. And as you can see, the results look pretty cool. Even though the anti-aliasing is still a little bit low res, the leaves do have bump mapping, and it is noticeable. I'm going to see what happens if I increase the intensity of the normal map from 40 to 100. It may go a little bit too much, but overall the variation in the leaves is looking good. You can see we do have some dead leaves here and there. There's enough variation to make them not look repeated, and the overall tone and balance of the lighting versus the reflection is pretty good. If we go to the reflection pass, you can see the leaves are kind of reflecting like they would in the real world. You're picking up some reflection from the backside and where the strong parts of green are. And then in the specular map, not every angle of the leaf is the same. You've got areas that are blowing out, just like in the reference image. Just bring that up. So you've got points that are blowing out, just like here. And if I save this, I'll just bring it into Photoshop and use the noise reduction tool to show you how that adds to the realism once more. So I'm just going to collapse this to 8-bit. I'm not going to do any post work on this. This is purely just to demonstrate this tool's effect. And once again, because the noise is a very obvious CGI trait, a lot of the times I was doing test renders and bringing them in and just purposely reducing the noise here, and then gauging whether or not I thought the result was realistic. So I'm going to go to Filter, Noise, and Reduce Noise. And you can see the massive difference this tool has. If I just play with the settings here, I like to preserve the detail a little bit. And now you can see the before and after. It's night and day. And all of a sudden gives it a bit more of a photographic look. So it's a really great tool, and now you know why I don't go all the way on all the settings, because I can get away with it. You can see all that noise that's in there all of a sudden disappears. And it even gets rid of the harsh black values that kind of are also a bit of a CGI trait, having that tons of contrast in the image. You can see the backlights coming through the leaves. We're getting that nice kind of lighting coming through. But let me just chuck the value to 100 and see what happens. Actually, I'll try doubling it and set it to 80. And 40 for the backside. So straight away while this is rendering, I can see that the leaves do look a lot better when you do increase the bump mapping. You can see here that we're actually seeing from all angles now that bump mapping coming up. However, when you do that, what happens is the specular kind of shifts a bit, and you'll notice now as that's rendering, we're losing a lot of those bright values. So to compensate for this increase in bump mapping, which is kind of in a way simulating glossiness, we're going to have to now increase the reflection amount. So we are getting those blowout areas. But the leaves themselves are looking pretty good. you can see in the specular now that they're actually picking up that reflection quite nicely. We're getting some detail in them into the leaves that we didn't have before. So I'm just going to cancel this render. I'm going to set the Fresnel IOR to 2.6. And that should do it. So for this particular material, there's really not much else I can do. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to re-enable the other trees we had in this scene so you can see where we're at. And then I'm just going to quickly run you through the materials used on the other two plants, which I've once again set up basically the exact same. The brighter green material has an opacity map on it. So apart from everything else, I mean, that's the only difference, just applying that opacity map. And I found a lot of success just making some quick randomizations to the diffuse color. But overall, once you kind of find a nice balance for a leaf that isn't really shiny and isn't really matte, you can kind of go both ways and experiment. And that's what I want you guys to do. I want you guys to bring in some of your own tree models and use these lighting scenes, but just change out the trees and the distribution just to see if the results you're getting are looking pretty awesome. So I'm just going to do a render of this. And hopefully adding that variation will bring back a bit of that realism. And then I can quickly show you guys some of the post work that goes into these images that I was posting on the Facebook page, because architectural artists are really good at hiding their secrets and hiding the amount of work they're putting into the post, because at the end of the day, all those ArcViz works you're seeing that are on the front pages of renowned websites getting awards, there's just been a lot of post work and color grading put into them. And it's kind of inevitable to end up doing that amount of work on them. But I always like to do as little post work as possible. So I try and get it as close to realistic in the render and come up with a quick solution in post. However, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, just before I left Cream, we were doing some plant shader work, and I remember doing similar stuff to this, but the results weren't looking as good in the render. And the reason we got around that is by having really good retouchers who knew how to work with the passes they were getting, and they were ending up kind of doing all this work that I'm doing in the shader in post, adjusting the reflection color, adjusting the lighting color, and things like that. But what I'm about to show you in post, it takes a lot less work. It's kind of just a few quick little changes you make, and you've got an image that looks a little bit more realistic. So here's the final result, and apart from being pretty noisy, I'm pretty happy with it. You can see that we've got some nice variation in the leaves. There's a kind of realism there, that there's enough variation and detail where you're not immediately thinking CG. However, it still does look a little bit CG here, and there's some things we can easily do in post work to fix that. So I'm going to load it in Photoshop and just run you through a basic workflow that I've been using while posting these updates to you guys. So the first thing I'm going to do is with the beauty pass, I'm not going to use any extra passes for this particular post work, but the first thing I like to do is I like to duplicate the image and just make it a lot brighter and kind of drop back on the gamma a little bit. And we're going to use this as a soft light pass. Then I'm just going to make it 8-bit. So now we've got two different layers. I'm just going to do a noise reduction on both of these. I'm going to set this to soft light and drop the value back down to about 30%. You can see what that's doing is it's just giving us a little bit more pop on the leaves. Maybe a little bit too much, and drop that to 25%. Then I like to collapse that down. I'm going to Control A and Control C to copy the image and paste it over again. And then I'm just going to desaturate the image. Go to the levels. I'm just going to adjust that. Until I've got enough kind of variation that the leaves, all the leaves aren't blowing out, but that some of them are. From here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this to screen mode and then drop that down a little bit once again. So you can see what that does is it adds a little bit of, it's hard to say, it adds a little bit less saturation into the reflection. Because we're screening this over the top and we're only screening the bright parts in, it just gives it a little bit more realism. But what happens is you'll notice that in the background now that's also blowing out. So technically if I wanted to, I could go back into the render and steal it from an alpha map, but because I haven't turned off the alpha in the HDRI, I'm just going to simply hand paint that out. So I'm just going to add a mask layer to it. And on a final production job, obviously you'd use an alpha for this, but I'm just going to paint that away. Just going to go full screen. From here, I'm going to add a color lookup over the top of this. And I usually like to just cycle through to see if anything nice happens where I'm happy with the colors. But basically, without this color lookup, things are a little bit too saturated and colorful. So I'm just going to try and find one overlay that just looks a little bit realistic and then tone it back. I can also save out the lighting pass and overlay that. So I'm just going to save that out. And what I can do is I can bring this in and set it to lighter color. And I'm just going to blur that slightly. So now if I zoom in a lot closer, you can see it's just adding a little bit of a glow to those really dark areas under the branch. And I'm just going to drop that down to 50%. From here I can add a hue and saturation and just play with maybe going more green. Sometimes what happens is during this process in post-production you end up losing a little bit too much color and it goes a bit yellowish. So you can see by just adding a little bit of a hue and saturation over the top of it, it just fixes that and you get your colors back to being a little bit more lush. So I'm just going to collapse this now. put high pass on. And sometimes it's good. This is just a nice quick way to experiment with sharpening the image. So you can see we get a little bit of crispiness back in. So I've just saved off this as a PSD file, and I'm going to compare it so you can see the before and after. A lot of the times I bring in the original render over the top just to make sure that I haven't gone too far with the post work, and if I feel like I have, like you can see down the bottom left here, things are just maybe a little bit too... You can just tell there's been a bit of post work done to it. So what I like to do sometimes is just overlay a little bit of the original render so the difference isn't so great. So that wraps up this particular scene. The next thing I want to show you is... Actually, you know what? Just before I finish this scene, there's one cool thing I wanted to show you. And that's when working with the V-Ray physical camera. If I just select that, you can see I've got in the bokeh effects, because I do have depth of field turned on, I've got a custom bokeh map. And in V-Ray, what those maps are used for is to simulate the shape of the opening on your lens. And let me just bring up an example for you. So you can see at the back here that when you do have this effect happening, it can look pretty cool. But one thing a lot of people don't realize is that you can also use colors in this map to simulate chromatic aberration. So when I zoom into the image here up close, let me just bring in the actual original render. You can see here that around the blurry areas, we're getting that nice color banding. And a lot of the times in post work, you'll see people overuse this and it ends up looking a little bit more realistic, but no photographer in their right mind would ever want that in there. Photographers do their absolute best to get rid of that effect. So I'll give you an example here. Let me just copy this original render. And I've got a tool here that I bought. It's similar, it's the exact same program actually to what Alex Roman uses to grade all his shots. Let me just... If I just add in chromatic aberration, you can see people usually do this. And this is basing the chromatic aberration on a spherical blurring, like towards the edges it happens more and towards the center it's happening less. Whereas in reality, usually chromatic aberration is happening where there's depth of field and where there's extremely bright parts of the image. So that's why I prefer to use a custom bokeh map, and it does that in the render engine itself. So let me just do an example test for you. And you can see I've got two different maps here. One, I've desaturated it a little bit, and basically I've got the white area of the map simulating the type of flaring I want happening, or the type of bokeh happening, and then the circles are for the color. So if I load in the overly saturated version of this and do a render, let me just do a crop render up here. You'll quickly see, even during the light cache preview, that it's just a bit too strong. But it's actually a really cool effect, and I think it would make a lot more sense for people to do chromatic aberration this way if you must have it in your renders, as opposed to doing it in that cheap post effect way. So there you go, you can see the more blurry the image is, the more that effect shows up, which is similar to how a real camera behaves. In the less blurry parts where the camera is more sharp and clear, that effect goes away. So also, there's just one more thing. I realized that in the last render, if I bring it up, one of the materials, the brighter green material, I thought wasn't looking as good. So I've done some adjustments to that. I'm just going to run you through how I've set up the new shader here. So let me just bring up the render for you. You can see now, even though I haven't done any post work on this, I've just brightened up the leaves a little bit so that they're catching a little bit more of a realistic yellowy green color and don't look so black and don't look like kind of too contrasty in the plant. Because those leaves are thinner, you'd expect more light to come through, and in this particular render that just wasn't happening. So after taking a second look at the render, I've gone in and made some adjustments, and now I think it looks a lot better. We're getting a lot more of a kind of realistic tone throughout those leaves. So if I just run through the shader here, you can see once again it's set up pretty much in the exact same way as the other material, except this time I've gone brighter with the textures. And when you go brighter on the textures, it just means more light's gonna come through the shader. You're gonna have a more vibrant looking plant, as opposed to that kind of eucalyptus feel where the leaves go really dark. On top of that, when the leaves I found are thinner, there's generally less variation among the leaves when they're healthy. So you can see in the tinting override, I've changed it from, if we go to the previous material we had, from 50 to 75. Now I've got it from 15 to 50%. On the back side of the material, once again, I don't have any extra variation. I haven't loaded some dead leaves because I'm trying to give the appearance that this plant is more healthy. So you can see if I go to the diffuse pass, there's still variation, but we're not getting like random dead leaves like you can see here. The plant is generally just a little bit more healthy. In the global illumination, more light's getting put through the leaves, so we end up with a plant that looks separate from the other tree. So when I look outside, I see a lot of the trees sometimes have completely different colors. Some leaves are extremely dark and others let lots of light through. So that will all depend on the thickness of your leaves. So I'd study, when you're trying to recreate a plant, just make sure you know how thick the leaves of the plant are. Also on top of that, if I just go into the reflection glossiness, you can see I've multiplied over this top part a little bit more, and the leaves are generally a little bit more blurry. Here's the front side. You can see I've got the normal map applied and I've got that set to 80. And then lastly, because if I take a look here and zoom in on the plant itself, you can see that this tree is using geometry for the leaves, but the way this tree is set up is that they're flat planes and I'm using an alpha map. I personally don't think these look as good, but when you're running out of space and RAM, it's sometimes a better alternative than using high-res geometry for the leaves. But also it's important to note that when working with this plant from VisPark, I did go in and do the same thing I did on these leaves, where I detached them and subdivided them. So I'll provide this scene file for you guys, and you can have a play around with these shaders and chuck your own trees in. But for now, I want to jump to a different scene, and if I just go to Photoshop here, the next thing I want to show you is when I've changed the lighting around now, I'm trying to get a more overcast feel. And overall, I'm trying to make the leaves look a little bit more wet and moist, just because just a little bit of moisture in the morning, or a little bit of a kind of like mildew that gathers up on the plants and ends up making things look just a little bit more reflective. So I'll load that scene up and just show you some of the adjustments I've made to the shader, and also the adjustments I've made to the lighting to get this scene working. So I've just loaded up the overcast scene, and you can see here that if I go to the HDR, actually first let me just bring up the render for you. So you can see the end result looks quite different now. We're not getting those harsh sun reflections in the leaves. However, we are getting a lot more blue reflection. Because of the overcast, you can kind of assume, or at least in this particular instance, that it's rained recently and that the leaves are going to be a bit more wet and they're going to be a lot more reflective because they have that water coating on the top of them. So if we go to the reflection now, you can see that the leaves are a lot more reflective. In the specular, they're also reflecting a lot more, and we've got a little bit more blue in the reflection, and that's because rather than a clear sky, we've got a little bit more of an overcast, saturated color happening there everywhere. So I just bring in that HDR. You can see it's just a really low res, blurred overcast sky. But what I found is that when you're working with the V-Ray 2 sided shader, it's always good to have a direct light in the scene to enhance that translucency feel. So if I go to the lighting pass, without that overhead light, you don't get such nice color coming through the leaves. And that's probably to do with the way the two-sided material handles direct lighting. When you're working with a HDR, V-Ray will split out the intense parts from the less intense parts and treat that as primary lighting. However, I don't think it's sampling as well as a simple directional light. So what I've done is I've gone in and added that light, and in the area shadows, I've just made that a lot larger. So now the shadows from leaf to leaf aren't as crisp, and you don't get such harsh blending between the shadowy areas of the leaf and the bright spots. You can see it's all a little bit more monotone. Obviously in this particular scene, I haven't put much effort into the way I'm scattering the plants. I'm just trying to teach you the way to set up the shaders. So if you decide to go in and use Forest Pack and build your own scenes, you can just work with these scene files and apply the shaders, hopefully getting you a better result than if you're working with the presets that are supplied with VisPark or stuff you've done in the past. So let me just open up the material. You can see on the material now that we've got a Fresnel IOR of 5, whereas before that was 2.4. So I've doubled that, and that's just so we get a lot more reflection happening. You can see on this second material here, once again I've changed the Fresnel IOR to 4, and in the reflection glossiness I've reduced the effect of this overlaying map that's being multiplied in, and I've also gone into the output and raised the glossiness of the leaf. So before, where this was down here, and you can see the leaf was a lot more spread, now I've brought it up so that it's catching more sharp reflections. I still feel like you could almost go a little bit more glossy on the leaves. There is definitely parts here which aren't giving that sheen appearance. So I'll leave that up to you guys to decide what you want to do there. And the other thing we've got in this scene is grass being scattered. Now once again, the grass material is pretty much the same as the other materials, except it's even less complicated. So let me just go in here and select. You can see the grass models I've supplied with this lesson. A lot of the times you'll notice that by default the clumps that are provided in packs, and this is probably thanks to when Peter Guthrie was releasing his tutorial on grass. It was years ago now, it was 4 or 5 years, and he was one of the first guys to show you how to use clumping and scattering to create grass. However, I always thought that when you're working with a perfect circular clump, you can kind of see that repetition. So what I've done with these VisPark models is even though the shader's the exact same on all the models, I've gone in and selected from element mode. What I did is I went to element mode and I changed the selection to the lasso tool so that in the viewport I can select kind of random polygons, and I just went in and cut out areas so that when this grass patch overlaps, it's a lot less noticeable. You can see I've also scattered in some dandelions. So first let me just bring up the texture for this grass here. You can see once again it's a two-sided material. We've got a darker translucency value. I don't have a as complicated setup for the reflection glossiness because the blades are so much smaller. You don't really notice that. They're so thin and kind of stringy that you're not going to be able to pick up the difference in glossiness based on the angle. You can set that up if you want, but I did do some tests and the results were pretty much the same and the render times increased. For the reflection though, you'll notice once again, because the stems of these grass strands are so thin, I haven't used a texture map for the reflection. However, I have gone in and used a fall off map instead of using Fresnel for the grass. And the reason for that is because had I loaded a texture map in with a bit of color to it, instead I decided I wanted to get that color in the actual gradient itself. So like I've explained to you in previous lessons, I've gone in and used the output adjustment and set that to RGB, and you can see here I've just kind of introduced a bit of blue into the reflection, and what that does is if you don't have that blue, I found that grass just doesn't look as good. In the reflection slot, this won't be as, it'll be a lot more bright and white, and it wasn't getting the result I was after doing that. So let me just load this into Photoshop and I'll show you how I added post work to this scene. So the first thing I want to do bringing this in is, once again, I'm going to use a very similar post-process workflow that I did on the previous example, just because I found that it was working each time. And I was doing this throughout my whole career too. Like pretty much every render I do, I always do something similar to this type of workflow. And in the mastering lighting course, that'll be one of the primary focuses, just how to quickly add a little bit of extra detail and realism in post, so that when you hand your renders off to retouchers or compositors, you end up giving them something that's just a little bit cleaner and a little bit making a little bit less work for them. So this time I'm just going to go up on the exposure, and because we're overcast now, I just want to increase a bit of the contrast. So I'm going to go down on the gamma here, and I'm just going to do a very small blur on this, and then make this 8-bit. From here I'm going to put this to soft light and drag this down again, and you can see it's just going to give us a little bit more kick in the image. And then I'm going to collapse that down and reduce the noise. You'll notice that on the grass here we kind of lose a little bit of detail. So to explain how this noise reduction tool works, the values I've been using, I've been kind of going up quite high, and depending on how much detail I need to preserve, I'll just slide this value up. But you can see the more high we go on preserve details, the less noise is lost. From here I'm going to duplicate the image, and I'm going to use the select color range tool, and I'm just going to select the sky here. The next thing I'm going to do is duplicate that. So now we've got this sky separated, and I'm just going to blur it a little bit, and what this is going to do is it's going to give us that kind of halo effect over the top of the leaves, and you can see that in Alex Prodan's work. And then from there I can put this on screen mode, and it's just giving us that halo glow. And because I've done a color range selection, it's also selected it on parts of the leaves as well. And then I think I toned this down a little bit, just because every time you do something in post, try to reduce the effect, because a lot of the times I notice, and it's hard to blame people, but they just go too hard on the post, and it ends up being quite obvious that you've spent a lot of time adjusting it from the raw render. From here I'm going to put a color lookup on and just play with that and just cycle through. You can see adding a bit of blue kind of changes the tone of the image and gives us that foggy morning feel again. I might go back to that, but first I'm just going to cycle through and just check out some of the others. You can see that one's quite nice. It gives the leaves, you know, a lot less contrast, which some photos have in the morning. So I like that one, this Kodak 5205, but I'm just going to duplicate this and just play around seeing if I can adjust it from here also, because I also like that foggy night, and I'm just going to drop that intensity a little bit. Alright, from here I'm going to collapse the image and then just create a duplicate of that layer. So basically I just go to flatten image, then Control A and copy the image and undo that, so in case I ever want to go back I've got that stack there. And then from here I'm going to go to Magic Bullet and just check out some of the looks it gives you. I wouldn't say I'm very good at post work, but I do like to sometimes play around with it. I try and get most of my results straight out of the raw render, and if I end up having to take more than a couple of minutes doing this post work, I kind of feel like I've lost the point, because a lot of the times what happens is you go through the job and you end up having to re-render stuff just constantly, and if the retouch is expecting the same result each time, every time you need to make an adjustment, you end up doing this same process, and it can change slightly each time. So before I drop the intensity of how this layer is being blended, I'm just going to do a sharpen on it, and I'm going to use the unsharp mask. And you can see what that does is because once we've reduced the noise, we've lost a lot of that detail, you can always go back and add it again. Add sharpness back over the top. So first you get rid of the noise, and then you go and sharpen the image back, and it ends up saving a lot of the time that you'd be waiting for with a really detailed render settings. So I'm just playing with some post work here. Just when you set it to lighten, it just gives it a little bit of vibrance and realism. So a lot of the reason for this looking not so good is obviously because the trees are intersecting the ground like this, and if you were going to be rendering your own scene, I'd expect you to put a lot more work, maybe scattering some plants around here that are a little bit more grounded and designed to be that way. Now I'm just going to tone that back just a little bit, and we're getting a nice kind of saturation in the leaves. Just adding a vibrance layer, and you can see how you just kind of work towards a little bit more realism, piece by piece. And I'm just going to group these two layers now because I've noticed that adding this extra bit of post work, you'll notice on the grass now that we've lost a lot of detail there. So what I do sometimes when that happens is if I'm happy in some areas of the image and not others, I'll group them and then add a mask, and then I'll just paint away the areas that I don't want this being affected. So now it's only adding that variation here. And there you go, I'd be pretty happy with that. So before I wrap up the lesson, I did want to go into a little bit more detail on the grass. However, I'll let you play with that because, like I said, the shaders are so similar, but I will provide scene files. Rather than explaining all the scene files, I'll just provide those for you so you can go in and use them. And what I am going to do is I'm going to do a competition based on this lesson, seeing just how far you guys can push this using a lot more detailed trees. I'm sorry, not more detailed trees, but a lot more variation in the trees. And the winner of that contest, I'll try and organize some prizes from Ronan Beckerman and VisPark, and possibly V-Ray themselves. So I'm pretty excited for that. So in order to break down the render theory behind these scenes and the settings I've been using, you have to understand that in a normal situation, V-Ray relies quite heavily on the scene samples. So in the first lesson, you'll notice that we set up the scene samples first in order to reduce the noise, and then from there we use anti-aliasing to clean up all the edges. However, when you're dealing with plants, the difference between each pixel is usually quite massive because of the extremely high detail in the actual object itself. So you notice here from one pixel to the next, it's basically just noise. So the best way to render scenes like this is to use less scene samples and more anti-aliasing. So you can see here, the primary thing I like to do is I like to set up the reflection. You can see here on the material, I've just left it at a default of 8 because we don't need anything more than that. On any material you've got for leaves, I wouldn't go higher than 8 by default. And then from there, with the global subdivs, you can actually take it down further. So if I'm putting this to 0.5, I'm effectively halving the number of samples and setting this to 4. So that value there, the global subdivs value, is extremely useful in determining how much scene samples you need to use. If I go into the global illumination tab, you can see that it's not very noisy, even with these low amount of samples. And that's simply because there's just lots of anti-aliasing samples on every pixel. So in the adaptive image sampler, usually where I'd have a value of 1 to 12 and a higher color threshold and rely on the scene samples, here what I've done is I've set the minimum subdivs to 4 because pretty much every pixel in this scene is going to need a lot of anti-aliasing. We've got grass everywhere, and you can see down the bottom, even these settings aren't high enough. So what we do on the color threshold is for final production settings, I go down to 0.005 so that the color threshold is low enough that it's picking up those small differences from pixel to pixel and applying the correct amount of sampling. So you can see on where we've got the flowers, around the edges of those we've got more sampling, or on the flowers themselves, but everywhere else in the scene we have a minimum of 4 anti-aliasing samples because that's what's required to get rid of all this high frequency noise. One of the things you do need to look out for is that when you're working with different HDRs, the global illumination might not be detailed enough. So what you can do is in conjunction with the GI samples, I've got those set to 16 because without that, in the GI pass, I was getting a little bit too much noise and I wasn't really happy with it. But also in the V-Ray light, I've got it set to 32 because we want clean shadows. The shadowy areas you'll notice here are the most noisy. On the direct light, I've got the samples set to 8, but if I was to go into production settings, I'd raise this to 16. And I've also got to make sure that the image filter is turned on, because without that, once again, the contrast in the leaves is just too great. So I find it's always better, and it's always extremely obvious when you're rendering and everything's really crunchy. And a lot of you guys have actually been sending me work lately, and there's just not enough anti-aliasing on your images. So you'll notice when I'm doing post work on scenes like this, you notice that when I'm doing post work on this, I first get rid of the noise and then I add back that sharpness. Whenever you're taking a photo of something, it doesn't have that same look as a render does. It's always a lot softer. However, it can be sharpened. So I try and replicate that in the post-work process so that we don't have any of that really obvious noise and the really obvious sharpening around the edges, because a photo just doesn't have it. If I bring up the difference between this, let me just load up the raw render and compare it to this one, you'll see what I mean. So as you can see, the default render is just a little bit too crunchy. It's a little bit too crisp, and the noise just makes everything look CG. So no one in their right mind is going to call that photo real. However, once you add the post work over the top, it's a totally different story. Which brings me to my next point. When you're seeing work done by high-end studios, 99% of the time there's a lot of post work done to it to get it to that final realistic state. I found that no matter what render engine you use, it's extremely hard to color balance the lighting without using these filters. So I think in lesson 5 I was talking about having custom cube files, which would be great to implement straight in the render, because by default, without this post work and color grading, it's always going to have that flat CGI look and feel. So just to finish up on the lesson, like I was saying, I'm going to try and run a competition for you guys and get some really good prizes. My fight's in a week's time, and I really appreciate all the patience you've given me in the lead up to that. I know I've kind of been delaying a little bit the deadlines that I've set for myself, and I really appreciate that you guys have continued to support me regardless. Once again, I want to thank VisPark for providing the models in this scene. I'm going to package the scene files up for you and upload them tomorrow. But I'm extremely excited to be partnering with those guys. Hopefully I can do more work with them in the future on the Mastering Lighting course. In the next V-Ray lesson, we're going to be going in and doing some architectural shader work, and I'm going to be collaborating with Ronan Beckerman on that. He's going to be providing me with a scene file to use, and I'll run through, try and spend an hour and a half, 2 hours breaking down how to make wood shaders, concrete shaders, and wall paint shaders. Thanks heaps, guys. I'll see you soon. Hopefully my fight goes well. I've prepared as hard as I can for it, and I'll see you next time.